You don't have to dig far into the late 1800s and early 1900s to find families killed with an axe. It happened across farm towns, rail towns, and cities where they were still trying to figure out how to handle violent crimes. We've already covered the Villisca axe murder, where 8 people were murdered in 1912. We've covered Hinterkaifeck in 1922, where a different farm tool was used, but the scene still carries the same level of violence. And those weren't the only cases in that era. There were similar killings in Kansas, Colorado, and Louisiana between 1900 and 1950, often in communities that were connected by rail lines and long stretches of unlit roads. A big part of that came down to access. Axes were in every shed and in every yard. They were tools that people used every single day, not something that anyone locked away. And when a town didn't have streetlights, didn't have patrol cars, and didn't have systems for sharing information with the next county, someone could walk in, kill an entire family, and leave before anyone realized what had happened. By the time New Orleans reached the late 1910s, the city had already seen its share of violent break-ins and unsolvable acts. But nothing prepared residents for the person who would become known as the Axeman of New Orleans.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity, venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
During the late 1800s, Italians were arriving in New Orleans rapidly. Business owners and sugar planters were bringing in workers from Sicily and southern Italy to replace the black labor force that they had relied on before the Civil War. Recruiters were sent overseas, contracts were signed, and shiploads of families were pushed into southern Louisiana. By the 1890s, thousands of new arrivals were coming through the port every year. Many settled in the French Quarter, and by the early 1900s, a section of the neighborhood was already being called Little Sicily. Now, the reception that they got was hostile, to say the least. Italian immigrants were hit with open racial slurs and treated like a problem that the city didn't want to deal with. Mayor Joseph A. Shakespeare made that clear in a letter about immigration. He described the Southern Italians and Sicilians as the worst people Europe had to offer. He called them idle and vicious and blamed them for diseases in the city. He went on to say that they lacked courage, honor, and every quality he believed made someone a good citizen. Historian Humbert Nelly noted that Shakespeare's attitude towards immigrants had a political angle. Shakespeare had been elected with the support of the state's Republican Party, which had lost most of its influence after the Reconstruction. His administration was fighting the regular Democratic organization, the political machine that controlled New Orleans. The Italian-American voters backed that machine, and Shakespeare's hostility towards them was his way of trying to win this political fight. Anti-Italian prejudice in the United States had deep Protestant roots that went back to Europe. By the time the country was founded, early settlers had already brought strong anti-Catholic attitudes with them. Those views were intensified in the 1800s when large numbers of Irish and German Catholics had arrived, and native groups pushed the idea that Catholic immigrants were a threat. That movement had started to fade before the Italians arrived in large numbers after the 1880s, but the hostility towards Catholic communities was still very much present. Italian immigrants faced another challenge when they reached American cities. Many arrived without priests or community leaders who could help them settle into the daily life. Pope Leo XIII responded by sending priests, nuns, and brothers to the ministries of St. Charles Borromeo and other orders. They helped build parishes and community centers in neighborhoods with growing Italian populations, including places like Our Lady of Pompeii in New York. The thing is, though, that Italian immigrants worked steady jobs and they just lived ordinary lives. By the early 20th century, police records from Boston and New York showed that their arrest rates were no higher than any other major immigrant groups. In fact, in 1963, historian James W. Vander Zander noted that Italian immigrants had lower conviction rates than American-born white residents. The violence against the Italian immigrants was no small thing. The largest mass lynching in American history happened in New Orleans in 1891, when 11 Italian men were killed by a mob. The events transpired after police chief David Hennessy was shot, and then 19 Italians were arrested and held in the parish prison. 9 of them went to trial, 6 were acquitted, and 3 cases ended in a mistrial. The next day, a crowd forced its way into the prison and killed 11 of those men. None had been convicted, and some of them had never even been in a courtroom. In the days that followed, the police carried out mass arrests of Italian immigrants under the claim that the entire community was criminal. Public figures supported the violence. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt, who had not even become president yet, called the lynching, quote, a rather good thing. John M. Parker, who helped organize the mob, was elected governor of Louisiana in 1911. He described Italians as worse than black residents and accused them of being filthy, lawless, and treacherous. Prejudice was high all around. The violence didn't end there, though. In 1899, in Tallulah, Louisiana, 3 Italian-American shopkeepers were lynched after treating black customers with the same dignity as white customers. A mob hanged 5 Italian-Americans that day, including 2 men who had absolutely nothing to do with the dispute. The anti-Italian sentiment also appeared in the revived Ku Klux Klan in 1915. A group targeted Italians and Southern Europeans as part of its push to protect white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dominance. Klan activity spread into the northern and Midwestern cities during the early 20th century, especially in places dealing with rapid immigration and industrial growth. South Jersey became the center of anti-Italian Klan activity in the mid-1920s. In 1933, a large protest against Italian immigrants took place in Vineland, New Jersey, where Italians had made about 5% of the population. The Klan eventually lost its influence there and left the city. By the early 1900s, Italian families in New Orleans were still living with the memory of the 1981 lynching and the constant suspicion that followed. Newspapers ran stories about black hand letters and extortion attempts, and any robbery or violent dispute in an Italian neighborhood was considered proof that the community was in fact dangerous. By the early 1900s, Italian families in New Orleans were still living with the memory of the 1891 lynching and the constant suspicion that followed. Newspapers ran stories about black hand letters and extortion attempts, and any robbery or violent dispute in an Italian neighborhood was considered proof that the community was dangerous. Police raids were common, so were arrests based on a little more than a name or an address. Although most families were just focused on work, church, and keeping their homes running. The town, though, the city, was still watching them through a very different lens. It was during this period that there started to be attacks and break-ins that later would be connected to the New Orleans Axeman. A little more than 20 years had passed since the murders in Whitechapel, and Jack the Ripper's name was still familiar when reports of axe and cleaver killings started appearing across the United States. Families were being attacked in their homes and often at night, some at close-range blunt force object violence. Some of those cases were connected to a man that the press called the Cleaver. Others were a part of a theory about a traveling killer who moved through the towns between 1911 and 1922. Travel was easy to manage at the time. Rail lines ran through almost every small community, and a person could board a train with cash and no identity. Freight hopping was also common, and boarding houses didn't keep records. A stranger could stay one night and leave before sunrise, and be in the next town by morning. Those early cases set the stage for what would later unfold in New Orleans, so we need to look at those first. On August 13, 1910, Harriet Cruddy woke around 3 a.m. to find a man standing in her room with a meat cleaver. Her husband, August, was already on the floor and unconscious from a blow. The couple had only recently opened their grocery store and saloon on Royal and Lesbos Streets, where they also lived with their sons. The intruder had come through the kitchen door. This would be a point of entry that investigators would see again in later cases. The attacker took $8 and left the couple injured but alive. August eventually made a full recovery, and it is believed by some that the attacker used August's own meat cleaver. On September 10, 1910, Conchetta and Joseph Rosetto were attacked in their bedroom by a man carrying a meat cleaver. The couple ran a small grocery store, and the intruder came in through the kitchen door, that same entry point used in the other case months earlier. Both Rosettos survived, but were permanently disfigured. Nothing was taken from the home. Instead, $23 was left in the store's register, worth about $700 today. The newspaper seized on the case. One headline in the Daily News read, "Jack the Axeman may seek the Ripper's honors." Some reporters even questioned whether the attacker was a woman after a size 4 footprint was found outside of the building. A few weeks later, a man named John Feehan was arrested for attacking several women on Canal Street with a knife. The papers labeled him Jack the Stabber and Jack the Slasher, and he was sent to an asylum for the criminally insane. The attacks, however, did not stop. In the summer of 1911, Joseph DeVie was killed in his bed with a meat cleaver, while his 16-year-old child wife laid beside him badly injured. This particular attack started rumors that suggested the Black Hand might have been involved, since the group had a history of threatening Italian grocers in the city. The lead investigator, who was Italian, received threats from men claiming to be a part of the group. Friends of the DeVie family tried to share what they knew, but most of it was brushed aside and the case stalled. No one was ever charged. That isn't to say that the police didn't question several men, but they were all released. For a while, things were quiet, but 6 years later in 1917, the killings started again. December 22nd, Sicilian grocer Epifanio Adelion was found dead in his bed, killed with a hatchet while his wife Anna laid beside him. Just like the other cleaver and axe attacks, nothing was taken from the home. And despite it fitting the Axeman MO, this crime is rarely included in the Axeman timeline, and part of that comes down to the state of the New Orleans Police Department at the time. The superintendent, James W. Reynolds, had been murdered earlier that year, and his replacement, Frank Mooney, stepped into a very chaotic department. Though it is entirely possible that Mooney just simply didn't connect the older cases to the new ones when he took over. On May 23, 1918, Joseph and Catherine Maggio became the first victims that were officially attributed to the Axeman at the time. Joseph was an Italian grocer, and he and his wife were attacked while they slept in their apartment on Upper Line and Magnolia. Their throats were cut with a straight razor. Both were struck in the head with an axe that was taken from their own home. Catherine's throat was so deeply cut that her head was nearly severed. Joseph was still alive when his brothers Jake and Andrew found them, but he died within minutes. The killer had entered by removing a lower wooden panel from the back door. It was the same method that was used in earlier cleaver cases. Money and valuables were left behind. The murderer changed clothes inside the apartment and left blood-soaked clothing behind. The razor used in the attack was later found in a neighbor's yard and was traced back to Andrew Maggio, who owned the barber shop. Andrew became the prime suspect. Police released him after failing to break down his statement. A few blocks away from the scene, officers found a message written in chalk on the sidewalk. "Miss Maggio will sit up tonight, just like Miss Tony." Investigators believed that this referred to the 1912 attack on Anthony and Joanna Ziambra, a pair of Italian grocers. Anthony was shot several times while sleeping beside Joanna and their infant. 2 bullets passed through him and struck Joanna in the hip. Their baby laying between them was untouched, but Anthony died at the scene. Joanna survived for 10 days before dying from her wounds, and no one was ever arrested. Miss Tony was a nickname that often patrons at her grocery store would refer to Joanna as. I also feel like it's important to point out here that one of the Jack the Ripper crime scenes also had a message written in chalk on one of the alley walls. It read, "The Jews are those men that shall not be blamed for nothing," which led investigators to believe that perhaps the Jewish community was involved in the murders. In the early morning hours of June 27, 1918, bakery driver Steve Zanka dropped off bread at the People's Grocery Store. When no one answered, he went around to the back door and found Louis Bessemer and Henrietta Ann Lowe in their quarters behind the store. Both were still alive, but they were covered in blood from axe wounds. Bessemer had been hit above the right temple. Henrietta had been struck over the left ear, and that blow to the side of her face caused her face to be paralyzed. The axe did, in fact, belong to Bessemer and was sitting in the bathroom when police came to the scene. The police arrested a grocery employee named Louis Obacon, even though nothing connected him to the actual attack. Henrietta, still in a daze, said her attacker was a mulatto man, but officers dismissed her statement. Nothing had been taken from the store or the living space, just like other axe attacks. Now, this case turned into quite the spectacle. It was the middle of World War II, and Bessemer's background brought up some questions. Investigators found letters in foreign language in his trunk, and the Secret Service had tried to speak with him, but he was listed as indisposed. Newspapers suggested the idea that perhaps he was a German spy. They also questioned why a man that they described as wealthy was running a small grocery store in New Orleans. Bessemer's excuse was that he and Henrietta were drug addicts and that he needed the climate for his health, but that was the extent of his explanation. And as it turned out, Henrietta was his mistress, not even his actual wife. So in August, she started to accuse him of being the one who attacked her and said that he had faked his own injuries to make it seem as if he was attacked too. Now the police, they couldn't explain how he had caused his own head wound, but they arrested him anyways. Now Henrietta's condition started to worsen in September, and before undergoing an emergency brain surgery, she once again named Bessemer as her attacker, and this time she said that he was in fact working for the German government. Now, this woman had a very severe infection, which most likely caused her to say all of these things. She was very confused. But sadly, the surgery did not help her, and she died on September 16th of 1918. Bessemer was indicted for her murder, and he was held without bond. He stayed in jail for 9 months before his case finally went before a jury, where they acquitted him after a very short deliberation. So this attack is sometimes listed among the Axeman cases because of the timing and all of the media attention that it received. But most historians don't believe it was actually a crime of the Axeman himself. Again, this is very similar to Jack the Ripper. There were a ton of murders going on in Whitechapel, London that all were very similar in nature, but only 5 of them are considered to be actual Jack the Ripper crimes. 28-year-old Anna Schneider woke up to a dark figure standing over her at the very early morning hours of August 5th, 1918. At the time, she was 8 months pregnant. Whoever was in her room hit her in the face again and again. Her scalp was split open. Her face was covered in blood, and she didn't remember anything after that. Her husband Ed had come home after midnight and found her on the bed. She was still alive. There were a few dollars missing from his wallet, but nothing else in the apartment had been touched. The windows and doors hadn't been forced open, and the officers thought that she had been hit with a lamp that had been sitting on the table beside her. For this particular crime, the police arrested a man named James Gleason, who they said had a record, but they let him go when nothing connected him to the attack. This particular attack does have a happy ending because Anna did give birth to a healthy baby girl 2 days afterwards. This is another one that often gets included with the Axeman crimes, but Anna wasn't Italian, and she wasn't a grocer. Her home had been ransacked, so most historians don't include this one as well. On August 10th, 1918, Pauline and Mary Bruno woke up to a commotion in the room where their uncle slept, Joseph Romano. Romano was an elderly Italian barber who lived with them. The women ran a small grocery store out of the house. When they went into his room, they found him bleeding from 2 very deep cuts to the head. He was still conscious at the time, and as they reached the doorway, they saw a man leaving. They later described this man as tall, dark-skinned, heavy-set, who wore a dark suit and a slouched hat. The ambulance arrives, and Romano is able to walk to it, but he dies 2 days later from the head injuries. The house had also been ransacked, but again, nothing was missing. A bloody axe was found in the backyard, and a wooden panel had been chiseled out of the back door, very similar to the other Axeman cases. In the days that followed, other grocers started reporting strange break-ins. One store owner said that someone had tried to get in through a chiseled panel in the door, but there were objects blocking the door so they couldn't get in. Another reported a robbery where an axe was left behind. Some residents called police to say that they had found axes in their backyards. The newspapers, of course, ran wild with this. They reported headlines like, "Is the Axeman a type of Jekyll or Hyde concept?" and "Police watch entire city for Axeman events." Extra police were also being put to work daily. A retired Italian detective named John Detanio spoke to the press about the case. He said he believed that the man behind the recent attacks was the same person responsible for the killings in 1911 and described him as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, someone with 2 personalities, 2 sides, and who killed without motive.
Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you.
On March 10th, 1919, the Axeman crossed the river into Gretna. Charles and Rosie Cordemelia were asleep in their house on Jefferson Avenue when someone came in through the back door, again through a wood panel that had been chipped out of the door. The axe used came from their own place, and again, nothing in the house was taken. Rosie woke up to Charles fighting with the intruder. She had their baby Mary in their arms. Before she could move, an axe came down on all three of them. Charles took several hits to the head. Rosie did too. Mary, however, the infant, didn't survive, and the axe used was left on the back porch. Their neighbor, Yolando Giordano, had heard the screaming and ran over. He was one who called for help. Charles was out of the hospital within 2 days, but Rosie stayed longer. Suspicion of the attack immediately fell on the Giordanos. See, there was already tension between the two families because at one point the Giordanos had handed over their grocery store to Charles and Rosie. At the time, Yolando was about 60 years old, and the family thought that he was too old to run the store. But at some point, they changed their mind and they asked for it back. So Charles and Rosie opened up a rival store on the exact same block. Now, while Rosie was in the hospital, she said that the police came in to pressure her into saying that the Giordanos were the ones who attacked her. They went in and would ask her things like, "Frank did it, didn't he?" When she was discharged, she was actually taken into custody, and she wasn't allowed to leave the station until she signed an affidavit naming the Giordanos as the attackers. Specifically, the police had suspicions on Yolando and his son Frank, but remember, Yolando was a 69-year-old man and in poor health. Frank was huge. He was more than 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, and he definitely wouldn't have fit through the opening of the door. Charles told anyone who would listen that his wife was wrong about the Giordanos, but still, the police arrested them anyways. The case went to trial a few months later, and it ran for about a week. By the end of it, the jury had decided that both of the men were guilty. Frank was given the death sentence, and his father was sent away for life. Charles didn't stay with Rosie after that. He left her and divorced her once the trial was over. Months later, Rosie was arrested for consorting with a man named E.J. Hickey. She told reporters that her husband wanted nothing to do with her and that she had to make ends meet. Not long after that, she said that she had a dream where St. Joseph told her to recant her story. And so she went to the Times Picayune and signed a 2-page statement saying that she had lied. She was threatened with perjury if she didn't stick to her original story, but she insisted that she knew it wasn't the Giordanos. Because of her recantation, the Louisiana Supreme Court reviewed the case. In April of 1920, the court granted the Giordanos a new trial. The ruling wasn't about Rosie's affidavit. It was about the district attorney's conduct. The Jefferson Parish DA chose not to retry the case, and the Giordanos walked out of jail. Apparently, after spending months in prison, it is said that Frank stepped outside. He stood in the Lafayette Square, looked out into the rain and the mist, and said, "Ain't it fine? It all looks fine." After a short time, he took the ferry across the river to tell his sister that he was free. And then, out of the fog, Rosie approached him. She dropped to her knees and she begged for forgiveness. Now, the newspapers at the time had played her up as a very sad figure. They called her pretty, that she had lost her baby, lost her husband, and after a bout of smallpox carried heavy scarring across her face. And after all of this, Frank did forgive her. Now, while all this is going on, a few days after the attack of Charles and Rosie, the Times Picayune got a letter. The header said, "From Hell," and it was addressed to Esteemed Mortal. Whoever wrote it claimed to be the Axeman. Here's the full text of how it ran in the newspaper.
Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit, and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know whom they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the Angel of Death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, swear, and by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall spared be in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee, I have been am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed either in fact or realm of fancy. The Axeman.
Now that letter got the entire city's attention. Clubs stayed open all night. People threw parties in their homes. Jazz bands played on porches, in living rooms, everywhere someone could fit a horn. A local composer, Joseph de Villa, even wrote a piece for the occasion called The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, and it became an overnight sensation. At 12:15 on March 19th, New Orleans was loud. Music everywhere, people awake who normally wouldn't be. And whether every house actually played jazz or not, nothing happened that night. There were no break-ins or attacks. No one was found with a chiseled door panel in the morning. Now, I have to stop here to once again point out the similarities between Jack the Ripper and the Axeman. Not that I'm saying that they are the same person by any stretch of the imagination, but there are a lot of similarities that could have been inspired by Jack the Ripper, and this one is the letter from hell. During the time of the Ripper killings, over 200 letters were sent to police and media, but only 3 of them are speculated to be from the actual Ripper, and one of them was a letter that was supposedly from hell. Just like this one here. Now, at the time, the city didn't care who wrote the letter. They took it extremely seriously. But most experts today don't think that the Axeman actually wrote this letter. Because when you compare the letter to what the witnesses described the Axeman to look like, they don't seem like the same person. The witnesses described someone who was a working man, somebody definitely lower class, a person who moved quickly, who struck hard, and didn't really give the impression of someone who sat down and wrote a carefully worded letter to the newspaper. And detectives at the time said the same thing. His attacks were messy and fueled by anger, not the behavior of someone who was composed or educated. Historian Miriam Davis thought that the author of the letter was actually jazz musician Joseph de Villa. Remember, he's the one who wrote The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, also known as Don't Scare Me, Papa. He would often use newspaper ads that referenced the letter and use the fear-mongering that came with it as a way to promote his song. Press at the time questioned why the Times Picayune would even print a letter without checking if it actually came from the Axeman. In fact, the West Bank Herald actually called them out for this. They said, quote, "Undoubtedly, the letter made good Sunday reading for those who like to read articles of sensational character. But we must stop to think the great amount of harm it has done to the ignorant class who are superstitiously inclined, and believe to a certain extent that this Axeman would visit certain families who did not have a jazz band. If the TP would have devoted the amount of space in an effort to capture the man who was causing these murders, it would have served the public to a much greater advantage than publishing of this joke letter, which caused a great deal of uneasiness and worry among the ignorant classes. Because realistically, just because the city played jazz for one night did not mean that the Axeman was finished. In early August, the murders started again. On August 10, 1919, grocer Steve Boca was asleep in his room when he woke to a dark figure standing over him. He didn't remember anything after that. When he came to, he stumbled out into the street and made it as far as his neighbor Frank Janusa's house before collapsing. His head had been cracked open. Nothing in the house was taken, and the back door panel once again had been chiseled out. Boca survived, but he couldn't recall a single detail of the attack. 3 weeks later, on September 3rd, 19-year-old Sarah Lawman was attacked in her apartment. The neighbors hadn't seen her all day, and they broke in to check on her. She was unconscious on the bed with a severe head injury and several missing teeth. A bloody axe was found out on the front lawn. She recovered, but like Boca, she couldn't remember anything. The attacker had come through an open window instead of a chiseled door panel, which led some people to wonder if maybe this was a copycat. Something big was about to happen, though, in October. On the 27th, Mike Pepitone's wife woke up to noises coming from her husband's room. When she got into the doorway, she saw a large man fleeing the scene. Mike had been struck in the head and was lying in a pool of blood. In fact, the room was covered in it. Even a painting of the Virgin Mary hadn't been spared from the blood splatter. He died from his injuries. His wife, a mother of 6, couldn't give the police anything beyond the size of the man that she saw. Some accounts actually say that she saw 2 figures leaving, but everything else about the scene matched those earlier attackers of the Axeman. What makes this so significant is this was the last attack. There were no more broken panels at back doors and no more axes left behind for police to collect. The intruder who had been breaking into and attacking Italian grocers at night had finally stopped, without any explanation. He didn't write again, and he didn't strike again. To this day, no one has been able to answer the question of who the Axeman was, but there are theories, and the one that people suggest the most is likely a man named Joseph Mumfre. According to witness reports and old police notes, Mumfre led a Black Hand-style extortion crew in New Orleans that targeted Italian Americans. In the years after the Axeman's last attack, in December of 1920, Mumfre was shot and killed in Los Angeles by the widow of Mike Pepitone. She told police that she recognized him as the man that she saw running from her husband's room the night that he was murdered. What makes this more believable is, according to old arrest logs, there were stretches when Mumfre was locked up, and those stretches happened to fall during the time where the Axeman had quiet periods and there were no attacks. He had left New Orleans right after the Pepitone murder, and the attacks stopped. That all sounds neat, right? Well, it's almost too neat. And that's the problem. Recent research hasn't provided any solid evidence that Joseph Mumfre was ever even killed in Los Angeles. Some historians think that the whole thing might have been just an urban legend that grew legs because it made for a good ending. Now, scholar Richard Warner did find something interesting. He found another man. He identified Frank Doc Mumfre, born in 1875, who also went under the alias as Leon Joseph Mumfre. The name appears in several spellings, including Manfrey and Mumfrey. Warner has connected Doc to a long, messy history of violence involving Italian grocers, extortion, and mafia feuds going back to 1910. In this version, the story starts with a failed hit on mafia boss Vincenzo Morrissey, followed by a string of retaliation killings in grocery stores. Several of those victims, Joseph Manzella, Joseph DeVee, Anthony Jenna, and Anthony Cybrema, were all attacked in ways that were very similar to those early Axeman cases. Warner found records showing that a man named Monfrey was arrested after Morrissey's murder in 1915. This man had already been connected to a 1907 kidnapping, a 1908 grocery store bombing, and an extortion case involving Italian shopkeepers. He served time, got out, and was picked up again for questioning in 1915. Then he left New Orleans around 1919 and resurfaced in Los Angeles under one of those aliases. Monfrey or Mumfrey, depending on which record you're looking at, ended up in a business dispute with a man named Angelo Albino. Albino disappeared. His wife told police that she believed Monfrey killed him. 2 months later, on December 15, 1921, Monfrey showed up at her house demanding money, and when he tried to hit her, she grabbed a gun and shot him in the head, chest, and abdomen. He died instantly. Only then did she tell authorities that she had been married before to a grocer named Mike Pepitone, the same Mike Pepitone who was killed in New Orleans in 1990. She said that Monfrey had killed both of her husbands. Now, this story doesn't line up perfectly with the marriage records, but the core of it has stayed basically the same. She believed Monfrey was responsible for Pepitone's death. She pled self-defense and was sentenced to 10 years. Warner's research suggests that the man later called Joseph Mumfrey was actually Frank Doc Mumfrey, a pharmacist with a long criminal reputation. Whether he was the actual Axeman is something that no one has ever been able to definitively prove, but he's the only suspect whose life actually lines up with all the violence, the timing, the disappearances, and the sudden end of all of the attacks. Speaking of mafia, that brings us to the Black Hand, because most of the Axeman's victims were Italian-American grocers, and some people wondered if these attacks were connected to early mafia extortion. Speaking of the mafia, that brings us to the Black Hand, because most of the Axeman's victims were Italian-American grocers. Some people started to wonder if these attacks were connected to early mafia extortion. The Black Hand was the name used for the threats that circulated in Italian neighborhoods at the time, which was usually in the form of letters demanding money, and that was backed by violence when someone didn't pay. So the idea was that maybe some of these families were being targeted for refusing to hand over cash. The problem with this theory, though, is that the Axeman left people alive. In fact, a lot of them. And the people who study the Black Hand crime said that that wouldn't have happened if these were real Black Hand hits. This is backed up even further because nothing was ever taken from the homes. If you are attacking somebody because they owe you money, you would think at the very least something would have been stolen, some sort of valuable to make up for the lost funds. There was also the issue of vendettas. Many Sicilian immigrants didn't trust the police. So when there was a dispute, they handled it themselves. And usually the police just let that slide. If someone felt wronged, they settled it the old-fashioned way. Some of the Axeman cases fit that sort of pattern in a way. Families with long-running tensions, business arguments, or grudges that never really went away. Andrew Maggio was the brother of Joseph Maggio, one of the first reported Axeman victims. He worked as a barber, and for a short time, the police looked at him as a possible suspect. The straight razor used in the attack belonged to him, which didn't help his situation any. But Andrew told investigators that he'd seen an unfamiliar man hanging around the house before the murders, and nothing in his story contradicted that timeline. With no evidence against him and nothing tying him to the scene beyond the razor, he was released. The most far-fetched theory, though, is the idea that the Axeman wasn't a person at all, but some kind of demon or evil spirit. His ability to sneak into people's homes in the middle of the night and just disappear as easily had some folks convinced that he really was what he claimed to be in his letter, the worst spirit that has ever existed, either in fact or realm of fantasy. This idea was pushed even further after the letter that the TP published in March 13th of 1919, the one where he said, "I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell." And the paper really leaned into that. New Orleans already had a long history of superstition and folklore, and people really ran with it. To add even more fuel to that fire, in April of 1919, the Irish Channel had this strange event happen where the water running through the gutters turned red. Some residents thought that it was a sign, either proof of the Axeman's powers or some kind of warning. As it turned out, It was dye wood leaking from a nearby wharf, but by the time anyone explained that, the rumors had already started to spread. The final name we're going to discuss is one that is a bit far-fetched, but I can understand why people may have thought it at the time, and that is that the Axeman was Clementine Barnabette. Now, connecting her to the Axeman case actually came from newspapers and not from detectives. Her murders had happened years earlier, in 1911 and 1912, in Louisiana and in Texas. Entire families were killed in their beds with an axe, usually at night, and the weapon was often taken from the home. Because of those similarities, the press treated it like it was all a part of the same story, calling them the Axeman killings. Now, Clementine had confessed to a very long list of murders. Sometimes she would say that it was 19 in total, and then other times she claimed 35. But the investigators actually connected her to even more, bringing the total to well into the 50s. She was convicted, however, of only one murder and was sent to prison in 1912, where she stayed until 1923, and then after that, she disappeared from the records. See, the problem with this theory was that by the time the Axeman of New Orleans had begun in 1918, Clementine was already in custody, and her crimes had stopped. Also, the Axeman's M.O. was different too. He attacked couples or small households, but not entire families, and there's nothing in the police files or court records that have ever connected her to the New Orleans attacks. Modern researchers have suggested that the coverage of Clementine's case was sensationalized. The papers also leaned into racial stereotypes, exaggerated the violence, and added hoodoo elements that were not supported by any sort of evidence. All of that created a moral panic, and that panic is kind of what created the connection about the axe murders in the region. Writers like Bill James, Rachel McCarthy James, and Todd Elliott say that Clementine's murders are a part of a completely different pattern altogether. Some believe that her case may be connected to the man from the train theory, which is one that we have discussed in both the Hinterkaifeck case as well as the Villisca axe murders. These authors do not consider her a part of the Axeman story. And so, that's the Axeman of New Orleans. He was a killer who moved through homes in the middle of the night, left families terrified, and then disappeared without a trace. The city tried to make sense of it. Detectives chased the suspects, and newspapers chased headlines. People blamed the mafia, blamed vendetta, blamed demons, blamed each other. But none of it ever gave anybody any answers. What we are left with is a handful of crime scenes, a letter that most likely did not come from the killer at all, and a name that became a part of New Orleans folklore, much like Marie Laveau. Whoever the Axeman was, he slipped out of the story the same way that he moved through it, without any explanation and without ever being caught. So the next time you hear jazz coming through an open doorway in New Orleans, remember that for one night in 1919, the entire city played it out of fear. And the man that they were afraid of is still a question with no answers. I'm your host, Amanda Joy, signing off. Thank you for walking down this crooked path with me. Keep your doors locked and your instincts sharp. Follow the path further. If this episode left you twisting in the shadows, there's more to explore. Follow Down the Crooked Path on TikTok and Instagram for more haunting visuals, behind-the-scenes lore, and updates on upcoming episodes. Every post is another breadcrumb deeper into the strange, the forgotten, and the beautifully unsettling. Stay curious and keep walking.